I'm continuing my reading, and what I'm doing in this series is to read through the entire standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This consists of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. I'm reading in a chronological order of events, not according to publication or volume, so I'm going to be skipping around a bit as I move along. Last video, I began reading in the book of Judges, chapter 16, the final days of Samson, and I will finish this out in this video. There's not too much left in this chapter. But we get the I'm not sure I can say tragic end, but very pitiful end of Samson. I have to say again, I like Samson. I think Samson was a good guy in general. He had his faults. He had a short temper, and later on in life, he started getting tempted into affairs with women. So he went and he spent the night with a harlot or a prostitute. And then he falls in love with Delilah and stays with her without marrying her. So he's living in a very sinful relationship. And Delilah doesn't love him. I have known that she is, it doesn't say she is a prostitute or harlot. She probably was. More like a courtesan in France, the high-class prostitute that chooses to be associated with certain high influential people. And she agreed to have Samson because he was a judge in Israel, one of the more famous judges in Israel. But as soon as the Philistines bribed her or offered her a pile of money to help them kill him, she turned on him instantly because she was only interested in the money. And through her connivings and her naggings, he finally tells her how to defeat him, and he is now defeated. So this is continuing that. Verse 21 in chapter 16, starting in verse 21. But the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison house. So now one thing I want to just step back a little bit. The verse 20, it says that the Lord had departed from him because his hair had been cut. The 7 locks. In other words, he probably had his hair braided because it had been growing for 25, 30 years. It hadn't been growing since he was born. He never once cut any of it. And so he had it braided, probably wrapped up so that it wasn't flying everywhere. But once it was cut, the blessing of God of his strength left him. And pay attention to this coming up here. So they bound him and they made him to grind in the prison house. In other words, they put him to work. But let us continue in verse 22. Howbeit, the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. Then the lords of the Philistines gathered them together for to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon, their god, and to rejoice, for they said, Our God hath delivered Samson our enemy into our hand. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, O God, our God hath delivered into our hands our enemy and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. And it came to pass, when their hearts were merry, that they said, Call for Samson, that he may make us sport. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport. And they set him between the pillars. Okay, so now, remember, they've blinded him. Basically, they stabbed his eyes out with red-hot pokers. And when they say, bring him in that he may make sport for us, is that taunt him, persecute him, slap him around a bit. He's blind. We can, offer him food or offer him whatnot. And, all these things. Just make a mock of him is what they're talking about. And they were able to. And after a little while, they set him between the pillars. So now 26. And Samson said unto the lad that held him by the hand, Suffer me that I may feel the pillars whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean upon them. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. And there were upon the roof about 3,000 men and women that beheld while Samson made sport. And Samson called unto the Lord, and said, O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee, only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson took hold of the two middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was borne up, of the one with his right hand, and of the other with his left. And Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords, and upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. Then his brethren and all the house of his father came down and took him, and brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, in the burying place of Manoah his father. And he judged Israel 20 years. Now, he's making sport for them. He is a mockery. He's being kicked around. He's being just persecuted here. And then there's a young boy who is kind of holding his hand, kind of like a support for him, or guiding him around, because he's blind. He doesn't know where he's going. And he says, Will you set me between the pillars so that I can rest for a minute? Because he's being persecuted. He's not just brought in and set between the pillars and they laugh at him. No, he's being carted around the room, being persecuted, and then he asks to be set still and rest for a moment. And then he prays to God. Again, Samson believed. He had faith. He was not an unbelieving heathen. He was a faithful, he wasn't completely faithful. He definitely had his faults. But he still believed in God. And he prays, and God gives him the strength once more, as his hair grew out while he was in prison. And when his hair grew out, as his hair grew, his strength came back. And he knocks the pillars down, and the entire building collapses in on itself, and over 3,000 people are killed, along with all the lords of the Philistines, all 5 kings. Now, the question is that some people have is, how is it that just knocking over 2 pillars collapsed the entire building? And the reason for this, it would have caused somewhat of a domino effect, but the reason for this, and we have archaeology for this in the area of Canaan, that these temples, these buildings were built so that you had the outer wall, and then the roof was built with 2 sets of beams that were brought in. And in the center were pillars supporting these beams. So you have the wall come up, and you have these 2 beams and the central pillars. 2 central pillars supporting 2 main beams, and the roof is built on top of that. But the roof also looks down in, so that it's not a complete roof, and it's all supported by these 2 central pillars that these beams are resting on. And when Samson pushes the pillars over, those support beams, those cross beams, fall in. The entire roof is supported by those cross beams. The roof collapses in, and the force of that collapse would cause a domino effect, collapsing the outer walls at the same time. So this is how it all worked out. And I know my hand gestures are not the greatest way of doing it, but you have your central pillar, and you have that, and when you knock the central pillar down, the beam that's supported by it falls in. So, and this was a common architecture style of Canaanite temples. So that's how that all worked out. Now, at about this, I do want to just make one last mention here, is that at about this same time, or shortly after this, is the battle that the high priest Eli, his death will become shortly after the death of Samson, making Samuel the next great judge in Israel. And Samuel actually becomes the judge for most of Israel, not just for a local area. He actually travels throughout all of Israel, as we will see later. But I just wanted to mention that this is just before those events in the book of Samuel. So that's what we're moving into next. And I'll see you then.